You're good to go.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Barnett. I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's QUASI seminar. These seminars are designed to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying topics relevant to corporate social innovation. And if I could get everybody
Good morning.
Yeah. All right.
So they sent you home.
Yeah. Can everybody please mute? Deb, can you mute folks who are not muted? These seminars are designed to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when studying topics relevant to corporate social innovation. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, teachers, and practitioners, we know that too many studies focus on questions that only rehash and rename established ideas, and they may have no practical impact. It's our hope that by pointing out what's known on all sides of the debate in very pointed and direct ways, that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our theoretical and practical understanding of how to help business better serve society. Today, we debate the question, do socially responsible managers violate their fiduciary responsibilities? Answering in the affirmative, we have Don Siegel. Arguing against, we have Rudy Duran. Clarifying the contingencies, it's Ed Freeman. And providing a practical perspective, we have Daniel Herstell. All right, so each of our presenters argue their positions. Please stay muted and post any questions or comments in the chat box. The open discussion will occur after all of our presenters have spoken in the half hour or so that remains thereafter. So let's get things started by turning it over to Don.
Thank you. I'm going to go to my slides. Okay, thanks a lot for inviting me, Mike. So I'm going to respond in the affirmative, and I put in parentheses, if they do not invest, quote unquote, in CSR strategically. So that's going to be the theme of my talk, what that means and why that's important. Now, let me see. So, but what I wanted to do to start out, I'll do what academics do best, of course, and that's engage in shameless self-promotion about my talk. But I thought it would be interesting for you to hear about my journey into the study of CSR, because one thing I love about management is there's a clash of paradigms in management, psychology, economics, and sociology, mainly, maybe a little political science. I came into this topic trained as an academic economist, and a neoclassical economist, in fact. But I studied two topics that are relevant to CSR. One was innovation, and I'm going to talk about that in the context of CSR. And the other was productivity and performance. So, you know, if you look at my resume, you say, boy, this guy works on a lot of different topics. But I like to think that there's a unifying theme of everything I do, and that is the measurement and analysis of performance. And as I was segueing from economics into management, I became aware of a literature on corporate social responsibility, which was frankly horrendous, both theoretically and empirically. And in 1997, we wrote what I think is the only methodological piece that's ever appeared in AMJ, which was a critique of the use of event studies. And most of the major event studies that we were critiquing were on CSR. Then there were the econometric studies, which were even worse. And we wrote a paper in SMJ criticizing that. But one of the things that we wanted to do, because there was also a lack of theory, was to try to establish some kind of theoretical framework for understanding how firms make decisions about CSR. And what we did in our paper in AMR in 2001 was outline what we called a theory of the firm perspective on CSR. And so that's the mindset that we have in approaching this topic. And I'm going to talk about that. But before I do that, I want to use the definition that we used in the AMR paper, because I think it's important, especially today when we're under siege, when companies are under siege, and we live in a global public health police state, that has confiscated, as engaged in the single greatest act of collective theft of all time, of private property, of services, of economic and personal liberty. So companies are right now part of the enforcement arm of this public health police state. So they're always under siege. They're always asked to take on more responsibility. They're always implementing additional regulations. But CSR means taking actions that appear to further some kind of social objective beyond the interest of the firm. Now, this is something that economists have studied for a long time, except they use a different terminology. They call it the private provision of public goods. So it's always been puzzling to economists why firms do this. Now, like many economists, I read Milton Friedman's essay on CSR, and I kind of agreed with some of it, because he was basically arguing that CSR basically meant that there was an agency problem within the firm, that managers were doing what was in their own best interest in engaging in CSR, not in the shareholders' interests. And he also was annoyed, as I am, about the fact that companies don't get enough credit for doing what is truly socially responsible, which is producing products as cheaply and efficiently as possible and raising the quality of their products. But I think Friedman's view was too narrow, because he wasn't thinking about it as a form of investment, as I'll describe. Now, thinking about this from a theory of the firm perspective means that we have to think about it in terms of demand and supply. So what we argued in the paper is that there's many elements of demand. There's consumer demand, there's investor demand, and there is, of course, additional stakeholder demand for CSR. And the way that we kind of framed it is that we should think of CSR as a form of innovation, a mix of both product and process innovations, creating new products or producing a product in a more socially responsible way. But this is not manna from heaven. That's the point. One of the points of the paper is that each CSR characteristic is valued by some consumers as well as other stakeholders. So there could be a legitimate demand for these social characteristics, or whatever you want to call it. But that means that we have to, because it's not manna from heaven, we also have to consider the costs of providing those characteristics. That could mean additional capital, additional labor, additional materials that are, costs that are higher because the firm has to respond to that demand and provide those additional characteristics or resources. Now, when you go down this road, and this is all in the paper, one of the interesting things that puzzled my economist friends is when we published the paper in AMR, they made us take out all the equations and all the graphs. They said, we'll only publish it if you take out all the equations and the graphs, because we had proofs of these things. But the intuition is very simple. CSR should be viewed strategically, and it can be an integral part of a firm's business and corporate level strategies. But it has to be viewed from the lens of cost-benefit analysis. You have to do a very thorough, and I believe this is in fact what managers do, weighing the costs and the benefits of engaging in these activities. And if you apply strategic reasoning to CSR, as I think you should, then you can use different strategic paradigms to evaluate and to predict patterns of investment. Now, the other thing that has always interested me about CSR is the role of information asymmetry. And the fact that we observe that CSR investment is highest in industries that provide experience goods or credence goods and services. This is something that has been verified empirically. But more importantly, that CSR is correlated with both R&D and advertising, because it's a form of product differentiation. It's a way to differentiate your products and to enhance the reputations of your brands. It should also be pointed out, I see that Petra is on the line, and Magali and Maggie is on the line. People who study industry self-regulation know these things, but CSR can also be used strategically in the context of preemptive strategies, which is what I wrote about in the AMP paper in 2009, to raise entry barriers, to forestall additional regulations, and to raise rivals' costs. And these are all, that was nothing novel. People had shown this before. The bottom line is that empirical patterns of firm-level investment in CSR are consistent with not just the theory of the firm, but with what I would call strategic and IO theories of CSR. So what are some managerial and policy questions that can be addressed if you go down this road? And I believe managers should view it strategically, invest in it strategically. One is, how do you allocate resources to these activities? The second is, what is the role of individual managers? We had a paper in JMS that looked into that. And then, what are the implications for responsible leadership? Now, in those exchanges I had with David Waldman in 2 leadership journals, I argued that responsible leaders should take their fiduciary responsibility seriously and only invest in CSR when it generates a financial return to the firm. And I firmly believe that to be the case. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Don. So basically, if they can make a buck from it, then of course they don't violate the fiduciary responsibilities. Let's now turn it over to Rudy.
Here we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. So, do socially responsible managers violate their fiduciary responsibilities? So I answer no, they don't actually. So the outline is actually it's a 2-pronged argument. Managers should act for the preservation and expansion of the firm, and shareholders recognize the value of responsible management. And so I will develop the 2 points, and I will add some new research questions as Mike asked. So the first point, managers act for the preservation and expansion of the firm. This may seem obvious, but it's probably not. And I think that what is happening is these times, and this is why that, as Donald was saying, firms are under siege by new demands, is that actually what we have been taught to our students, managers, executive education, etc., that shareholders own the firm has been debunked for a decade or more now. And this Friedmanian or agency theory mantra is contested based on, basically the legal definition of the firm. And so that would be part of my argument. So firms do not just belong to shareholders. Of course, shareholders have a property title that they can vote and benefit from their investment and their ownership. But legally and more and more, the reason why we see the notion of purpose is that shareholders put together their capital in order just to accomplish something, which is to provide good products at the best cost possible, for instance, as Don was saying. But it's not just profit. The firm in and of itself has its own legal object. And with this in mind, so I'm providing here, for instance, a reference. You can have a look at this book. It's quite interesting in showing the different institutional perspectives of what a firm is and what it is not, and why we have confounded actually firm corporation and company, for instance, in the way we discuss these topics, and why also the very practical and efficient fiction of the shareholder value maximization, as we taught it, as which has been valid, is probably these days less and less valid because of the negative externalities that overcome the positive externalities of this kind of formalization of the firm. And so if we take the idea that actually managers should obey boards and shareholders, boards are the representative of the shareholders, and the shareholders are not just limited to their property, and so, but also to the way they devise and conceptualize and organize the firm to meet its purpose, which can be, creating vaccines, solving telecommunication problems or whatever. Well, when you take this seriously, so this QUASI, which is actually a term we created in this document, which is just for the sake of reflecting about these notions. If you're interested, it's available on SSRN. So this idea of QUASI, that shareholders actually have this dual role, the property, of course, that we all know, but also the propriety, just to play on the etymology of the two terms, which is what it is convenient for the firm to do, to accomplish. Then the nomination of the board members that represent the shareholders and actually govern the firm for the interest of the firm, for its purpose, pursuing its purpose. Well, then managers, by acting responsibly, which is with respect to the firm purpose, in that case, they don't violate their fiduciary duty. They just respect actually the mission that has been given to them, which is to accomplish the firm purpose in a profitable way, for sure. So hence, by being responsible, managers act in the interest of the firm and of its shareholders. Then we have evidence from some recent works that shareholders recognize the value of responsible management as well. So, for instance, the most aggressive shareholders separate undue managerial value appropriation or purpose washing from business-related embedded CSR. When the CSR, which is actually a proxy probably for responsible management, embedded CSR, not just superficial or peripheral CSR, which is more rhetoric or sugarcoating or marketing. But we, in a paper with Marc Desjardins, for instance, we just found that the activists, the hedge fund activists, actually attack firms which are CSR oriented more, but actually they don't do this when there is evidence that the CSR, if you wish, orientation is connecting with a bottom line. So even the most active and aggressive investors make the difference. Long-term investors also tilt their investments towards CSR active firms. For instance, in the replication of Olga's, Ronnie, and Will's actually study, we found like them that being included in DGA side, for instance, doesn't change the volume of the actions that are of the shares that are exchanged or the share price itself. But we found that actually long-term investors buy more of these shares when the firms are actively engaged in CSR and recognized as such. So aggressive investors, long-term investors, asset managers also recognize and now develop new market and investment categories to actually grapple with and ensure that their investments are responsible. And so therefore, if you take together these two arguments, because managers should and actually act for the preservation and expansion of the firm in accordance with the purpose that the firm received from the shareholders, and shareholders recognize the value of responsible management, then managers as agents of the firm and not as agents of the shareholders, as agents of the firm, and by the principle of shareholder duty, need not limit their understanding of fiduciary duty to financial performance only. By acting responsibly, they meet their duty. So what, I mean, I think that this, if we take seriously the legal definition of the society, which is the firm, and these roles here, I think that these are some consequences for the way we research in strategy. And so responsible management is not just CSR. It would be something like, purpose-based strategy or embedded CSR strategy. It's a strategy. And hence, I think that this could lead to a redefinition of the strategy field as encompassing financial and extra financial performance in a monetary fashion. So I think part of the task that we try to accomplish, to achieve, would be actually to measure better these extra actually externalities or extra financial performance, and to find a way to monetize it, so that when managers maximize, if you wish, the bottom line, actually they include these components. Second view, stakeholder management research must formalize it. So here I'm creating this thing, a time discounted. So today, when you do actualization, the future as a discount, okay, should it be actually should it be the present to be discounted more, for instance? Or so what would be the way to formalize a time discounted or a time accounted model of value contribution from the different shareholders and a value claim that they can therefore ask for on the firm performance, to help managers decide on trade-offs and actually respond to their fiduciary duty in a responsible way. And I think that if stakeholder management doesn't do that, I mean, it will not be it will not be used in theory and so much, and even less so in practice. And then strategy research needs to acquaint again with the philosophical underpinnings of sharing, because what we're talking is not just about value creation, it's about value sharing to act responsibly, and probably morality in management. And we have three schools, in philosophy that correspond to morality, which is deontology, so the Kantian philosophy, consequentialism, and ethics of virtue from Aristotle and the others. And so I think that these are three areas that seem to me being very fruitful for future research. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Rudy. So I think we're starting to see, the tension between the notion of, what is good long-term strategy for a firm versus, what are clear net present value positive kind of payoffs. Turn it over to Ed for a bit more of some of those contingencies there.
Well, I'm gonna a little bit be kind of the skunk at the party here, because I feel like I've just entered Mr. Sherman's Wayback Machine back to the sort of 1980s, where we're debating about two ideas that I think we should be long past. So that's one of the reasons I'm a it depends. I probably am more sympathetic with Rudy than Don, but let me try and see if I can clarify this a little bit. I mean, the first idea is both of these ideas, so I don't really understand the question. Both of these ideas are very much contested by, it's not clear to me that we understand fiduciary in the right way. Look, in 1930, that's damn near 100 years ago, a philosopher by the name of W.D. Ross wrote a book called The Right and the Good. And Ross gives us an alternative to kind of the Kantian utilitarian ideas of the time, in which he says, look, duties are prima facie. It depends on a lot of stuff like circumstance, those kinds of things. Fiduciary duty especially is an idea that says, well, I have a special duty to shareholders, given that other things are equal. Now, it's nice because in theory, you can always make other things being equal. In practice, they're almost never equal. So it's not clear to me what work fiduciary duty understood as not an absolute duty, but one that depends on ceteris paribus, what work that does. And there's several things I've tried to list here that tries to argue that, and they're a lot more than the ones that I've listed here. Let me hang on. I think I just screwed something up here. There we go. The same goes for CSR. I have to say I've never understood the following scenario. Let's say Mike has a business, and Mike, I know your business makes customers' lives better. They love your products. They're willing to pay for them. That's great. Suppliers want to work with you because you make them better. There's a long line of people who'd like to work for you because you treat them with respect and dignity, and communities want you there because you're a community builder. And by the way, you're making money hand over fist. What I want to know is, are you socially responsible? I have absolutely no idea what that means. I've mellowed a little bit. I think there's a role for social responsibility thought of as somewhat more than your obligations to stakeholders, but it's a tricky business. The fact that there's not much agreement, there's still contestability of both of these ideas is part of the problem. And then I think both of these ideas are kind of left over from the kind of old narrative about business. They're left over from what I've called in other places the business sucks story. You need CSR because, by the way, if business sucks, then we got to do something to lessen that. And it's a little bit like the mafia killing people during the week and going to church on Sunday. We need fiduciary duty to be sure shareholders think they're getting what's due to them. And the truth of the matter is, every business has always and will always create and sometimes destroy value for customers, suppliers, employees, communities, and people with money. I've said that way too many times to ever say it again, but more than likely I probably will. And I think we could do without the ideas of both CSR and fiduciary duty, and really try to understand how companies create value for their stakeholders, understand how the value created for one affects the value created for the others, and not how we can make more precise trade-offs. But I would agree with the spirit of what Rudy said, how we can avoid trade-offs by understanding the intersection and the mutuality of those interests. And CSR and fiduciary duty will never get us to that. In fact, it'll keep us from dealing with that. And so finally, framing matters. In the words of one of my heroes, of Van Quine, ideas and hypotheses don't confront the tribunal of experience alone. They always bring their background theory. They always bring other things with them. There's always interpretation. And the real problem here is not so much CSR versus fiduciary duty. It's not so much that we don't have an alternative. We do. That's what the hundreds of people doing stakeholder theory have done. But the real problem is the positivism that is run amok in management journals. It's run amok for way too long, and it is in danger of making pretty much most of what we do simply irrelevant. I'm very optimistic about what businesses are doing now. They have kind of gotten the message and they're out doing it, even though, obviously they're not all doing it the same way, and they certainly are not avoiding all mistakes, but we need a different way to think about what we do. And I think that's something. I've given a few references here to some pragmatist text. I think that will help us give more meaning to what we're doing in business. So I'll shut up with that.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, we're trying to get beyond kind of the big philosophical thought and get at something a bit more pragmatic or practical and think, what is this actually, when the rubber meets the road here, where do we see some actual definitions of things or some boundary conditions? And so we'll turn it over to the lawyer now.
I'm just trying to stop sharing here. There it is.
Okay.
Got it.
All right, thanks. Yeah, so Daniel, can you give us a practical perspective, please?
We can't hear you, Daniel. Can we?
No, we can't.
Can you now? Can you
Yes.
now hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And do you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good, perfect. Sorry for this minute lost. So because I don't see you anymore. Anyhow, I would like to, I'll give you the equivalent of fiduciary duties in the European context. And what I would like to do, and using my experience, is try to show how those obligations of a manager are currently evolving and broadening extremely quickly, and that will have an effect on the responsibility regime. So probably that, well, I'll give the answer, but the answer to the question is probably yes. Responsible manager is acting in the interest of shareholders, but his liability may come from other sources. So if I skip to the present situation with respect to management autonomy is here in a civil law context the result of two basic features, which are on one side, as Rudy mentioned, I think earlier, we have the concept of ownership, which is considered as an absolute and exclusive right, and that has an effect on the way companies are perceived here. They are, as Rudy said, they are perceived as being owned by, they are considered as being owned by the shareholders. However, if you look at the second feature, which is our commercial company law, you see that we are in a regime that for tens of years is marked by stakeholder primacy. And in particular, the law on commercial companies, it's 1966, enshrines the corporation as a standalone institution independent from its shareholders. In the 80s, or since the 80s, particularly the 90s, things have changed under the influence of the US shareholder primacy. But more recently, and in particular with a law 2 years ago, which I will comment a bit later, we are going clearly back to stakeholder capitalism. So fiduciary duties to shareholders do not exist as such in the civil law context. The obligation under the law of 1966, as I said, the corporation is an independent institution, and the obligation of the managers is to act in the corporate interest of the company. That's really the basic of the obligations. And his liability will be judged, except for some specific text, with respect to the corporate interest of the company. The president, directors, or general managers of a corporation are liable if they make in bad faith the use of the property or credit of the corporation to be contrary to its interests. So So what is the corporate interest? It is the basis for court to determine whether a manager is liable for mismanagement. Law does not define what the corporate interest is. And so you have over the years perspectives which range from the corporate interest is just the interest of the shareholders to the interest of the enterprise itself. The corporate interest is the enterprise, or the firm, the interest of the firm, which is a synthesis of the different categories of the stakeholders, which include the shareholder. So it has been disputed by courts within the court, because they are really the ones who use, go back to the preceding one, sorry, who use this concept. And now they are slowly moving even more clearly than in the past to consider that the corporate interest includes the interests of all stakeholders. This evolution has been emphasized recently, 2 years ago, in 2019, where for the first time the concept of corporate interest has been included in our civil code. The civil code really meant, when it speaks of corporations, it refers to the shareholders. It indicates that a company is formed in the interest of the shareholders. But in 2019, so you see very recently, it has been added that it is managed in its corporate interest, and it has been specified, while taking into account the social and environmental issues related to its activity. This was really made under the leadership of Macron. I know we are in a presidential campaign, but as he is not yet declared as a candidate, I can mention this. It's the idea pursued for that new was really interesting. The initial idea was expressed in the following way: a company is not just a place for the shareholders. It is actually the place for a firm where a number of interests meet. So it was a very ambitious law. The way it is drafted is a little bit debatable, because you could say that if you have to specify that you have to take into account social and environmental issues, it would mean that they are not included in the corporate interest. But that's not the way it is applied. What is interesting is that, and going to the last point, the draft enshrines the concept, but does still not define it. And that goes back to a comment which has been made earlier by Ed, I think. And why is that? Why doesn't it define it? The relevance of its practical application rests on its great flexibility, which makes it resistant to any confinement in pre-established criteria. The elements necessary to determine whether or not a decision is contrary to the social or corporate social interest depends too closely on the protean and changing characteristics of the activity and environment of each company. I think that's a very important specification. And so what you see is that I think this is interesting compared to what happens in the US. CSR, to a certain extent, by the way we approach it now here in France, is inserted in the definition of the strategy. It's not something next to it. It's really when the board defines a strategy, it has to take into account social environment issues and the corporate interests. So we don't have that dichotomy, which I think will be helpful for the evolution of the firm. And I also agree with that I'm fairly optimistic as to what firms are going to do. In addition to that was a question I saw of specific, what happens if, in terms of liability, if you have more and more CSR obligations enacted by law, well, then you don't raise anymore the question of compatibility with shareholders' interest. I just hope that it will not be the way things will develop. What is interesting and what is happening now, at least in Europe, but I know it's to a certain extent the same in the US, is that there is a growing pressure on managers from different sources, which will have an effect as to their liability. And you could, and I'm going quickly on this. There are first something which is very new, pressure from courts, and you have a landmark decision in the Netherlands, where Shell has been obliged by a judge in The Hague to reduce its CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030. And a similar lawsuit has been opened against Total Energy. This is made at the initiative of an action group called Milieu Defensive, which is a Dutch branch of Friends of the Earth. They have no harm. But they just considered, and their lawyer, which is now fairly well known, Cox, consider that one of the big reasons for the judiciary power to exist is to bring balance in society and to protect us from human rights violations from our governments, but other large entities. That's really interesting, because that's something new. Up to now, you couldn't see that. The court only acted where there was a specific damage caused, at least in our system, a specific damage caused to a party, and when there was a link between an act and the damage. Here you have something very new. I see that time is passing, so I'll go quickly. But obviously, you understand that on the obligations of managers, this has an importance. Just note that this group now sent recently more than 29 letters to large groups, large multinational companies acting in Netherlands, and threatening them of exactly the same type of court actions. You have another phenomenon which is fairly new, is pressure from society, from people without any specific link to companies. We have a case in France, Orpea. You can maybe take more time. Very recent case where a journalist described how elderly residents of nursing homes were mistreated, and the company share price reduced by 60% in a few days. What does this have as an effect on managers' obligations for their shareholders? Because obviously there was a very, very direct link between dividends and the ways elderly persons were taken care of. Well, obviously, shareholders' expectations tend to change. It is something very well known, also in the US, and we have here in France exactly the same investors. It has been mentioned also earlier. In the UK, you probably know that they call that the enlightened shareholder value. That's a growing trend, in particular. And that's maybe the last point I would like to make, through the influence of activist shareholders. Activist shareholders activists are almost everywhere. The question is not in a company, will you have an activist shareholder, but when will you have an activist shareholder? And to a certain extent, the institutional investors are becoming are maybe not activists, but at least active. And that creates new obligations for managers, which therefore have, in the way they treat in their perception of shareholders' interest, there is a strong move which makes, as a result, that when they are responsible, they actually act in the interest of shareholders. This raises many questions. So I have them on my last slide. I won't go through them now. Many questions. How will their liability vis-à-vis third parties develop in the future? Nobody knows. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, when you showed me those slides, I'm like, how is that guy going to get through even any of those? But you were able to cover the high notes, so thank you very much. We've now heard from each of the panelists. So what I'd like to do now is just to open it up to the panel to now that you've heard everybody's perspectives, are there any additional points that you'd like to make or anything you'd like to ask of each other? Or as you've seen the chat, is there anything in the chat that you'd like to highlight? And in the meantime, if folks in the audience would then like to raise their hand, I've seen a few questions, but I'm not sure if they've been resolved in the meantime. So if you could just raise your hand and I'll call on you after the panel has done its round. Anybody like to start? And we could go back to Don since he started us off.
Okay.
Yeah, Don, do you have any additional thing? I mean, look, it's pretty straightforward. If the firm makes money off of it, then obviously, there is no violation of fiduciary duty. So there's, thinking out beyond that, are there some additional ways of not only kind of codifying what that means, because a lot of that comes down to measurement. That's,
Well,
very,
my feeling about CSR has always been that it's kind of like innovation. And managers, I recall doing a lot of research on how managers justify firm investment in innovation. And it was always a challenge. I mean, we wanted firms to invest in innovation because there are spillovers from it, and it's very good for the firm and it's very good for society. But it was always very difficult to get managers, within the company to agree to finance investment. So the people who were making such decisions were able to develop more sophisticated tools to justify firm level investment in innovation. And I don't see that kind of quantification. I hear a lot of loose talk, but I don't see any kind of rigorous analytical method to try to quantify the benefits so that firms can make the case. I want firms to make the case for strategic investment in CSR. I really do. But on the other hand, I'm very conscious of the fact, and I do believe that the property, the firm is owned by the shareholders. And I believe in private property. I don't believe that the corporation is owned by society. The corporation is owned by the shareholders.
I mean, we do have some other seminars that talk about, the measurement ability of this, but I am curious.
That's good.
Do you think that this is something that, managers, if they want to do this, can fudge the numbers any way that they want to do this?
Well, I don't know why I haven't seen a lot of hedonic studies on this. I mean, there's lots of tools that are used in marketing and other fields to try to quantify the benefits of adding characteristics to products. And I'd love to hear from some people. There are these corporate social responsibility managers out there, right? Every major company has one, and I'm sure they produce these annual reports. When we did our conference for JMS on CSR, one of the first that was done, we had some of these managers come from McDonald's and other big companies, and they claim that they were able to quantify the benefits.
Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting to figure out exactly how they do it. But I've done some work, for example, on real options reasoning, where you can make anything work if you just slightly tilt the number, especially if you're looking long term. It can compound it and put it in intangible terms. But
well, I thought there was a great question in there. especially. We did a special issue of personnel psychology. I wanted to get these micro people interested in this topic. So there's now been a flurry of studies by the micro OBHR researchers on this. And I believe that some of those studies do, in fact, quantify the benefits, at least in the HR function, of investments in CSR, in employee retention, productivity, those kinds of things. And that's a good thing to do. I like that.
Okay. Well, clearly, if we can make the numbers, the question is how to make the numbers. But if we make the numbers, there's no real debate. But Rudy has pointed out some other things beyond just even making the numbers that might still play here. So, Rudy?
If I may react just quickly, there is no doubt that the owners of the shareholders owns the share of the firm. So I think that this is clear. What we are saying is that the firm as an entity as especially in continental Europe, other obligations, as I think Danielle illustrated. And so, and this will be more and more the case, and including for banks as well, that invest in companies, and new rules for quantifying the externalities that their investment in firms or financing, crediting firms represent. So that's one point I want you to make. The second point is, I think that we have really a great avenue for collaboration between academics from different crowds. So you mentioned the micro, the economists, but also the strategists, etc. And where I will slightly diverge with from what Ed said is, I think that the solution is in modeling a bit more, is in providing the tools for not just researchers, but managers to actually do and make these calculations so that they are not, sensitive to some of the assumptions that you put in the models, as you just mentioned, Mike, so that, and I would say, not in favor of pragmatism, because contrary to the title of the book you put on the screen, I think that pragmatism is not anti-authoritarian, is that actually it doesn't enable clear justifications for the practices and the tools and the measurement that are being used. And so I think we need a little bit here, a bit more, I'm not sure it's positivism the right term, but actually some modeling and offering the tools for a convergence on some tools and calculation of value, defining performance as both financial and extra financial, but monetized value as well, so that there is an alignment and a convergence, and not the situation we still have, which is raters that produce their own ratings with their own measures that has been shown actually modify the data that they had from the past to make them look better. I don't know if you have seen this kind of evidence for manipulation data in Asset 4 or some other data sets. So we really want, and just to have a stronger and better measurement in order for managers and us to progress.
I think, Ed, pragmatically, have we done anything here to pull ourselves out of the 1980s, or are we still stuck back there?
I'm not opposed to people having models that we agree on. I think Rudy's right about that. We see that now with ESG, with a lot of the things that are going on. And if you look at something like what Engine 1 has done, that's what they're trying. That's what they're trying to do, but they're doing it in the context of how to understand stakeholder capitalism in a more precise way. Most of the legal people I talk to, and again, I don't know them all, but I do know Lynn Stout has argued, and a number of people have trumpeted this, that in fact, shareholders don't own the firm. Firms in the US, firms own themselves. Shareholders own shares of stock. And that's a very different kind of thing. Maybe there's a moral argument that we should treat shareholders as if they own the firm, but most economists are loath to make any, or think they're loath to make any moral argument, or at least fess up to the ones that they made. Having said that, I think shareholders are important. I've sort of never denied that. It's just this trade-off between shareholders and other stakeholders is a false trade-off. And it's one that doesn't work very well in the real world. So I wish we'd stop doing that. And we could get past this sort of Milton Friedman question, which really was the Burley-Dodd debate in the 1920s. So no, Mike, unfortunately, I haven't heard much that would help me, that would make me optimistic.
All right. Daniel, are you seeing in practice, in law, any of these come to a head in legal settings about the trade-offs between managerial and firm interests or shareholders and stakeholders and so forth?
Well, I think it was the important question in the past, but I think it's a question of the past now.
Yeah.
It's a question of the past. The shareholders do not own corporations because a corporation is a person and the person is owned by herself. But shareholders own shares, and yes, they are important. They are important in defining the purpose of the company. They are important in selecting the management. They are the ones who set the framework on basis of which investors are going to invest or not. And then there is something completely different, and which appears now more and more clearly, which is the role of the managers, which have within the framework, and our notion of corporate interest, which you don't have, but now slowly in the Anglo-Saxon environment comes this notion of purpose. But it gives them both a room of maneuver, a certain margin to appreciate how that can translate in specific projects, but also it limits fairly well their decision power. So this opposition between shareholders and the shareholders' interest and managers' behavior is really reducing in here. We don't have court cases. We almost have no court cases where shareholders sue managers on basis of decisions they took. And more and more, where we are converging now, where a situation where there will be an interesting discussion between the two, where managers have to represent also interests probably unknown in the detail, at least to the shareholders. And that dialogue is interesting. There is one, and I'll stop there. There is one player which you haven't mentioned, which is the board. And one comment on somebody mentioned ORPEA is interesting. Yes, ORPEA is extremely interesting because also what is the responsibility of the shareholder? He took I'm not speaking of specific persons, but he took the dividends every year without being concerned of how the care homes were run. So we are really getting in a new world where yes, there is a purpose, there is a necessity of dividends, but all of that has to be taken by arbitration of interest, which sometimes are in contradiction. So I would not separate strategy and CSR.
Yeah. It just seems so hard to imagine a scenario where they say, the manager decided to sponsor this little league team, and so now we got less dividends, and so now we're going to sue you. I mean, that would be handled in, probably whether or not they support the continuation of the firing of the executive and things like that. But let's take some questions from the audience here. David Orozco.
Hey, thanks a lot. Sorry about that. So yeah, my question in the chat was kind of relating to this topic where large companies, willfully take smaller companies' patent and exploit the high costs of litigation and uncertainty in the U.S. at least for patent rights nowadays. That could seriously cripple the small company. Is this a CSR issue? And if so, how does it get decided?
Yeah, that seems a great one for Don to probably start with. What do you think?
I heard that expressed as I've never heard that expressed as a CSR issue, but yeah, I think it could actually. I hadn't thought of that. That's a neat way to think of it. Sure. I mean, we normally, when we think of CSR practices, we don't relate it to innovation. But I hadn't thought of framing it as that. So yeah, I like that. I might use it as an example in my own course.
It's sort of an abuse of power, if nothing else.
Yeah, no, I like it. That's a good one.
Any other perspectives from the panel? All right, thank you. Yeah, we'll go to JW, please.
Oh, and by the way, on that same note, you may notice that the pharmaceutical companies are trying to be a little more socially responsible with vaccines, and because they control the patents on other kinds of drugs. This issue comes up a lot. Another topic I study a lot is technology transfer from universities and federal labs to firms. And Yale University was criticized for not making certain drugs available in the third world. So, you know, issues of CSR do come up in innovation, both with firms and with universities. So yeah, that's a good example.
JW?
Yes, Ed already said what I wanted to say, which is that shareholders do not own firms. And we keep saying that, and even people in Europe, even Rudy, at first said it, and then the second time, Rudy, you said, no, they own a share in the firm. And then, of course, the lawyer explained to us what that means. They don't own the firm owns itself, they own a share in the firm. And I just want to repeat that, but then the follow-up question is, why do we keep saying that? And why even in Europe, where that has never been, in continental Europe, in France, in the Netherlands, where I'm from, in Germany, that has never been part of the law. And yet we say it. I've got colleagues who think that in the Netherlands it's like that. It's not, it doesn't say it anywhere in the law. So the follow-up question is, where does this come from? And I think we should understand that, yeah, if anybody has a share in the firm, shareholders have a share in the firm, the question is, what rights does it give them? So this is a property rights question. Which rights does it give them? Those rights, whichever rights they are in whichever legal system, are contested.
Surely it's chiseled in stone somewhere, right, Ed?
Well, JW, I think we say it all the time, especially those of us who teach in this area. We say it all the time because we're absolutely in the grip of the old story.
Exactly.
Absolutely in the grip of it. It's why we still talk about CSR. It's why we still talk about fiduciary duty. It's why we still debate Milton Friedman. My God, let him rest. We have defeated that so many times. It's like,
But,
you know, beating a dead horse.
I'm not sure I agree with I'm not sure I agree with the last point, Ed, in the following sense, because one of the reasons that we are saying this is because this has always been contested, and there is historical work on this. There has been a concerted effort of Friedman and other Chicago school economists to influence the thinking in the legal domain. So there have been economists who have been pushing certain ideas about private property on the legal community, pretending that a firm is private property. It isn't. It is not private property. Of course, as soon as you start accepting that a firm is owned by a firm, from moral reasons, managers need to do what is in the interest of shareholders. That makes sense. Morally, if you accept that the shareholder owns the firm, managers should do what is in the interest of shareholders. That makes sense.
But that hasn't worked even in Delaware. I mean, even in Delaware, that's not the law.
Well, you mentioned Lynn Stout, and there's a whole bunch of people. And at the very least, even in what I've read about US law, I'm not an expert, but what I've read about US law, at the minimum, it's contested. Yeah?
At the minimum, that's right. That's correct.
And that's where we should start. We should never say these people own no, there are rights. Rights need to be defined. How they are defined is contested. And as business school teachers, whether we're in a strategy like I am, or in business and society or organization theory, doesn't matter. You know, let's start from there and acknowledge that if we don't do that, if we keep repeating it, business schools are a conduit for false ideas that are extremely ideologically and politically laden. And we should be very, very aware of that.
Any further perspective from the panel?
Yeah, maybe very, very briefly, three very brief comments. One, the idea that the company is owned, or the firm is owned by by the shareholders is still a very lively idea in very important circles. So it's an idea which still has to be fought because it exists. Second, maybe one of the reasons is that when a company is small, when it's created, it's not unusual that the same person is a 100% shareholder or almost 100%, the CEO and the chairman. So maybe it could come from that. Third comment, yes, it is important once you have said clearly that the shareholder is not the owner, you have to define what his role is. He has not to be put aside. His role as owner of the shares has a financial component, but also a voting component, which is extremely important, as I said earlier, in setting the purpose and deciding who manages. And my last point is that a comment has been made earlier by somebody. Yes, the company is not owned by the shareholders, but also it is not owned by society. Because there is a trend now to consider that society owns and has a say on everything that a company does. That is as wrong as a company is owned by shareholders.
All right, thank you.
Yes, if I may add to that, so I think that for a view of the firm where it pursues its corporate interests and that the managers actually accomplish this instead of just maximizing shareholder value, that means that we need to have as potent intellectual and models. And one of the reasons why lots of people in business schools keep presenting shareholders as the owners of firm is that it becomes simple to expose certain phenomena basing themselves on agency theory, because then you can understand the agency relationship, the short-term, long-term discrepancies between shareholders, managers, spate of multiple issues that can be dealt with a simple model that relies on erroneous assumptions, but has been was a workable model for explaining firms' decisions, investment decisions, economic growth, etc. What we've faced these days is that over the last, let's say, decade or so, this summative, restrictive model is not efficient anymore, and the benefits it could provide, if any, and I think that there was, because some figures can show that, well, capitalism has still enabled certain technological progress, reduction in poverty, etc. All of this is debatable, but still. But what is sure is that if these benefits were accurate, the negative externalities now do more than overcome the benefits, and that's why we need a different model. But frankly, we need to find this model that says that I pay long-term contractors, such as the employees, the suppliers, etc., a certain fixed price, call it salary or etc. for each of them. And there is one stakeholder which is of different kind, which is the residual claimant. It puts its money at risk, and therefore it gets more after that all the other claims have been paid. I mean, this is basically the underlying logic. And the stakeholder model does not enable to have a simple and efficient modeling to, in a sense, counterbalance the simplicity and efficiency of the model that has been used for decades in at the business schools. And so we need this new modelization where the different stakeholders are integrated, the extra financial performance can be monetized so that we can compare and contrast and put the trade-offs in front of managers or future managers, and that they will act on them, not just based on bottom line, but also on their own morality. So they would have just to interrogate their own morality in making decisions.
It's just like so much of what we do. I mean, it's a simplifying heuristic, and so it sells and it sticks. And so, is the quality of your article only based upon the journal in which it's published? No, but that's what we use. Is the quality of your teaching only assessed by a point number that students give you? No, but that's easy to measure, and so we do that. So it has a lot of sticking power as a result. Samra, your question, please. You're muted if you're talking. I can't tell.
Yes, I see it. Thank you. The shareholders own the company, yes, but more importantly, how do companies generate capital? So we have the Anglo-Saxon model with capital market orientation, and the continental European model with, or Germanic model with bank orientation. And we have Latinic group with bank plus family funds orientation. So based on this orientation, the context changes. So in Anglo-Saxon model, because the disciplinary power is the market, then their understanding of fiduciary duties may change when compared to a Germanic model where the source of funds is banks, and they are even request representation at the boards. So their understanding of responsibility, fiduciary duty changes. Plus, another point I want to add is the product liability concept. So it only covers physical harms, but fiduciary duty should cover physical as well as psychological harm, social harm, which are not included in product liability concept. So that has a limiting power or role to our understanding of fiduciary duty. So it should be renewed, revised to cover social harm done, just like in the example of artificial intelligence. We no more talk about physical harm done, but psychological harm, social harm, harm to one's autonomy. So we need new concepts, broader, covering the recent developments. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody like to respond to those comments? All right. Sarah, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. I did just want to say that I really agree with Samra on the point about expanding our understanding of harm and fiduciary duty to take into account these more nuanced but very real types of harm. But I wanted, my comment / question was about the legal case and sort of adding maybe a layer to what our European colleagues have shared with us today and sort of addressing a question to them. My understanding is that with the rise of mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence legislation in Europe, we're actually seeing a hardening of CSR expectations that should have quite a strong impact on our understanding of fiduciary duties. And so I don't think I heard it. I heard about a number of other corporate law developments in Europe, but it struck me that one thing that was missing was a discussion about mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence, which seems to be, at least from my perspective as someone who is business and human rights obsessed, let's say, seems to be a real game changer. So I was very curious to hear from our European colleagues' thoughts on this. Thank you.
I can briefly answer. I went quickly through slides, but if you look at them after this discussion, you'll see that there is one exactly on the item you mentioned. Yes, there are more and more obligations by statute related to CSR issues. But also, I would just add again that the new element in which you could be interested in, and which happens here very strongly, is this intervention by courts without any specific damage created. imposing, and I think that's a trend which will develop in addition to the laws, which will impose the constraints on companies. And one very personal comment: I am not a big believer or fan of too much legislative and regulatory constraints. You could still hope that companies integrate in their strategy human rights issues and climate issues and biodiversity issues. That's really a name. We said earlier, it's a person. You could wish that a person integrated in its strategy those issues, and that's also a path we are doing in Europe. I tried to illustrate it before, and it is also a game changer. And maybe last point related to what you said, it's interesting to see there is no legislation on that, but recently a number of groups left Myanmar on the pressure from media, society, social activists. And it's interesting, the shareholders' short-term interest would be that they stay in Myanmar, because the activities were profitable. But can you operate in a country where human rights are violated? It's really a very interesting topic. How do you make the conjunction between that pressure and the company's interest? It's even a more complicated one than the one we discussed earlier.
Yeah, it's intriguing just to see, how much either the U.S. model of show us the money in this process starts to dominate Europe, or the reverse holds true, and it's more of can the European influence, shape what American companies feel like they owe society? But Rudy?
Yes, I will be very brief. I just wanted to follow on Sarah's comment and share with you a link about Ecocide and this very influential campaigning just to make Ecocide actually a crime, an international crime that would be actually taken care of by the International Criminal Court, the one that actually deals with genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. And CEOs, as well as Bolsonaro, for instance, would be actually liable in front of this court if this crime was to become an international crime, I think. For the damages that person in charge of large institutions and not being able to ignore the consequences of some of their acts, diligently committed or let the organization actually take action or keep on taking action that would have damaged irremediably natural environment locations. So I just shared the link with you. And I think that this is also part of what managers and what decision makers will have to have in mind in the future.
All right, well, thank you. I don't know if there don't seem to be any additional questions. Do we have anything else from the panel that you guys would like to further address? Well, this is, I think, the one time when we actually end early. I don't know. All right, well, thank you all very much. A sincere thanks to the panelists for a great debate. Many thanks to all of you for participating. The materials from today's session will soon be posted on the RICSI website, which is at ricsi.business.rutgers.edu. Please join us for the next quasi seminar on March 11th, when we'll debate the question, does corporate social and environmental reporting really matter? That session will feature Jody Gruwall, Charles Cho, Paula Quattrone, and Ken Pucker. Hope to see you there. All right, again, thanks. Thank you very much.